Hello, Sophia. How are you?
Good. How are you?
I'm very well. I'm very, very well. Um, Lots going on in the world. Um,
Yeah.
sometimes I really do wonder, quite how sane our leaders are, or whether they're sane at all. Sophia, did you see the article in The Economist? Very interesting article. Not where you'd expect to find it. It's about China-US trade.
Oh,
And basically it says that actually nothing has changed. There's been all kinds of talk about decoupling, but that actually there hasn't been any, because there can't be. It's really
yeah.
I suggest you read it at some point. The
Okay.
Economist is a weird magazine. I mean, I can't stand it most of the time, but every so often, precisely because I can't stand it, I find that I have to
Yeah.
read it. And I find a fairly interesting article there. Anyway,
And
how are you?
yeah, good. I'm doing well. Yeah, I agree. Another packed week, of course. And one of the things I do want to discuss with you later is about this 60 Minutes interview. Nicholas Burns, Leslie Stahl interviewed the ambassador to U.S. ambassador to China, Nicholas Burns.
Right.
That's also an interesting interview. So,
Right.
um, yeah. But anyway, let's
Okay. You'll
start.
have to take me. You have to take me through it, but do
Yeah,
that,
yeah,
and we'll
yeah, I
we'll.
will.
Okay.
Let's start first with the Middle East. The U.S. Soldier, he's with the Air Force, Aaron Bushnell. I'm sure you heard that he died.
Absolutely. Of course I
Yeah,
have. Of course I
after
have.
self-immolation outside Israeli embassy in D.C. So what exactly is your reaction, and what is the British media's reaction to it?
Well, the British media's reaction is that it didn't happen. There's been virtually no coverage of it at all, which is incredible, actually. I mean, this is an astonishing action, and incredibly, I mean, for a person to set themselves on fire takes an incredible amount of determination and anger and all kinds of other things. So this is a huge step by a US soldier. And, as a US soldier, deeply patriotic, one assumes people like that joining the US Army, after all, they're the kind of people you would expect to be most loyal and most defending the United States. He's clearly furious about he was furious, because he's dead now. He's furious about what was happening, what the Israelis were doing, outraged by the genocide, as many people are calling it, correctly, in my opinion, in Gaza. And he is obviously very, very angry that the United States is supporting it, which it in effect is. And he decided to make the most powerful statement any human being can make, which is to make this one. And it's incredibly dramatic. And as I said, there's been a complete news blackout about it in Britain. I mean, I haven't seen a single article that mentions or discusses it. And I'm just old enough to remember the 1960s, as I've discussed many times. During the 1960s, there were protests in South Vietnam against the government at that time in South Vietnam. And they were led by Buddhist priests, or monks, rather, I should say, people of that kind. And there were moments when some of these people set themselves on fire, and it was shown around the world. And the president of the United States at that time, Jack Kennedy, was horrified, and that affected his decision making. But this time, of course, we don't want to see it. We shut our eyes, and this powerful message that we was sent here in the West, we don't want to see or hear.
I find sometimes the British media is even more hawkish than the US ones. At least the CNN did talk about this. CNN, they didn't show the footage, but they described the whole thing. So at least I saw that the CNN did describe what happened accurately, that this person is protesting what's outside the Israeli embassy because he feels so bad for the Palestinians. But at least, and the Britain has said nothing. So meaning Britain is even worse in terms of reporting these things compared to the US media. Is that right?
Absolutely, it's much worse. I mean, there are still glimmers of debate in the American media. I mean, you will still get articles that you can read and be interested in the places like The Hill, Foreign Policy,
Mm-hmm.
National Interest, these kind of magazines. And of course, the US also has a very extensive military media. The military people, ex-military people have, various magazines and things like that, which can also be quite interesting. We've got nothing like that in Britain. In Britain, media is very dominated by a small group of big media outlets, and it is intensely controlled. Now, to give you an idea of how intensely controlled it is, about 10, 15 years ago, I remember reading an article in a British newspaper called The Independent. It's one of the broadsheets, but it's perhaps a slightly smaller one and less influential than the others. But there's an article there which said that every Tuesday, the foreign news editors of the big newspapers in Britain attend a meeting at MI6 headquarters, and they meet with the chief intelligence officers there, and they're briefed about the stories for the coming week. That was in The Independent. That was in a British newspaper. Now, I can assure you, you will not find that article anywhere on the internet. It's been completely deleted. And I suspect that if you tried to find back copies of The Independent that has that story, printed copies of The Independent in libraries and those sort of places, you will struggle, because clearly someone at some level in the media was very worried about this, and they disclosed that this sort of thing was going on. But obviously the intelligence agencies and the powers that be didn't want any follow-up or questions about it. So I happened to read that article. I discussed it on Craig Murray's blog. Craig Murray's an important blogger here. It attracted some very, very strange comments from some people I was rather concerned about. So I stopped the discussion. But I mean, it gives you an idea of how controlled the media is here and who ultimately is in control of it.
One thing I noticed that like when you listen to Chris Hodges, right, and probably even Cy Hurst, those kind of a classical, I would call them old schooler American journalists. Now, they all complaining that in the 50s and 60s and probably 70s, at the time, the media is more or less pro-government, the manufacturer consent, that kind of thing. But you can still hear a lot more dissenting voices. Like Malcolm X was on PBS, and you see him often there, according to Chris Hodges. But not anymore. That like a mainstream media is very, very, very extremely rarely to invite anybody like people, certainly not, Malcolm X kind of people. I wonder whether part of the reason is that not only they are more consolidated, the private media companies are just 5 of them, probably 6. And also the other thing I find is that the mainstream actually afraid of the competition from the self-media, from the alternative media. So for them, if the government punishing alternative media, like censoring, it's a good thing. It's kind of like help them to get rid of some of their own competitions. And that's why for them, it's good just to line up with the government. Whenever the government want them to say anything, they just go along with that. That way they protect themselves. Do you think there's
it's
something
absolutely
of that?
It is absolutely correct. I mean, the mainstream, the legacy media, the big newspapers, the old television channels, I mean, they are the single most vocal supporters of this disinformation narrative, because basically what they want everybody to think is that they give you the real information and everybody else gives you disinformation, and that everybody else is controlled. Well, in Europe, it's by the Russians. In the US, it's by the Russians and the Chinese. They want you to basically stop listening and comparing news stories or forming your own view. And you're absolutely correct. I think everything that you say is correct. And the point is, and what makes them even more aggressive and even more seeking the support of governments, is precisely the fact that despite all the censorship campaigns and propaganda and all of that, their position is still eroding. They're gradually losing more and more traction because people can see that the newspapers are all telling them the same thing. And, most people are not as interested in news and politics as we are, but they sense that something is wrong and it doesn't accord with the experience of their own lives. And so they look for news elsewhere. But the more they do that, the more they threaten the position of the mainstream media, the legacy media, and the more aggressive it becomes, and the more dependent on government it becomes. You're absolutely right.
Yeah. It's interesting. Because if I remember correctly, when TV came, the radios saw that as a real threat, right? They have done some fight there back then too. But we probably just right now in the middle of another fight, right? The legacy versus the alternative media. So this is another fight.
Well, this is absolutely correct. Of course, that was a fight that was fought in the United States.
Oh, okay.
Much more so than it was in Britain, because what happened in Britain was when television was launched, for about a decade, television broadcasts were exclusively made by the BBC. This is a difficult fact for people to understand, but the BBC actually, which was originally, of course, with radio, controlled television. And then in the 1950s, what was called independent television was permitted, but in a very regulated and controlled form. So, it was a different situation in Britain. In Britain, the media has always been much more controlled in the United States, because the United States, in spite of everything, has a republican tradition. It has the First Amendment of the Constitution. It's much more in the culture in America to have a widespread, diversified media landscape with different views, and of course competition is much stronger there. In Britain, and by the way, in most European countries, the media tradition is different, and the government exercises historically a much tighter control over it.
Okay. Now, going back to the Middle East, the one thing the media doesn't report too much about, but I'm curious about the Palestinian Prime Minister. He submitted the resignation, the government's resignation. So what does that mean? I mean, in China, lots of people online feel like Fatah does not have much of a legitimacy. Is that right?
He's absolutely correct. I mean, I speak to people from the Middle East. One of the people who I'm very close to is a man called Alistair Crook, who was a British diplomat who knows the region incredibly well. Lots of stories about the kind of things that he did. I've never discussed them with him, but if you believe them, some of them would make him a bit like a James Bond in the past. But anyway, he knows the Middle East backwards. He knows all the governments. He knows the Israeli government, all the Arab governments. He knows the Palestinian factions. He knows Hamas. He knows Fatah. He knows all of these. And his comment is very straightforward. The government, the Palestinian, the Fatah movement, the old PLO, amongst Palestinians is completely discredited. No one takes it seriously, that it's been seen for a very, very long time now as essentially doing America's and Israel's business in controlling the West Bank, thereby making it easier for the Israelis to establish their settlements there. So it is very discredited. It's also seen as very corrupt, and there is intense opposition to it. Now, the fact that he stepped down is also partly, I am sure, connected with the fact that there is a very interesting meeting apparently going to happen in the next couple of days in Moscow, where representatives of the Palestinian Authority, of Fatah, are going to meet with Hamas. And there's talk about finally setting up a new Palestinian government that is going to represent all the factions, and which will be much more credible for the Palestinian people. So it could be that some pressure from the Arab countries, the BRICS countries, Russia, which has a long history of being able to deal with all of the factions, has been brought to bear, and this is maybe what has triggered this step.
Okay. Well, that's interesting to see then. Well, yeah.
Yeah.
And then also there are a few things happened the past week is that China sent a legal team to the ICJ court, right? And gave their full support to the Palestinian, supporting the South Africa argument. even said that things like armed resistance is justified in the international law, and gave plenty of examples, etc. Now, I have to say this is pretty unusual for China to be so prominent, going to the court, arguing these kind of a fashion. And the only thing I take away is that China lost patience. Like, something has to be done. This thing, is go long enough. And of course, the Lula also compared Israeli action in Gaza to Holocaust and got Israel very angry, and ended up they demanded the apology, and Lula didn't, and recalled the Brazilian ambassador to Israel, etc. So it seems to me like Lula is also frustrated with the situation, right? So is that the sentiment now? Is more and more people just getting impatient and get frustrated?
Well, I think this is exactly right. I've never heard of China. I've never known of China doing anything like this. And by the way, this has made a big impact. Maybe not, again, in the media and landscape in the West, though it's been reported to some extent there. I mean, there's been pieces, if you like, in Britain and the Financial Times about it. But around the world, this has gained enormous traction. I mean, bear in mind that China is the equivalent superpower to the United States in terms of totality of power. Its economy in purchasing power parity terms is bigger than the United States. So this has made a very, very big impression. And it was a very, very powerful contribution. And by the way, the point about, resistance against occupation being legitimate under international law, that is not controversial. I mean, this is a well-established law, and has always been so. After all, that's what the American colonists argued in their own Declaration of Independence. I mean, let's not forget that. So this is not a controversial thing, but it is a major break with Chinese, the way that China acts. And it does, I think, it conveys a number of things to the world. I think one is exactly the point you've made, that China has lost patience, but not just China, the world has lost patience. Countries around the world are looking to China. Brazil, the BRIC states, the Arab states, the Muslim world, they're all looking to China at this time for support in this issue, over this issue. China itself, I think, beyond the fact that they are losing patience, because every single day we see these horrors being committed in Gaza, and there's no sign of them ending. And the administration always tells us how concerned they are and how upset President Biden is and how angry he is with Prime Minister Netanyahu, and that he goes on vetoing every single resolution that's put to the Security Council that might appear to be trying to stop this thing from going on. Anyway, the Chinese are aware of all of that. They want to show to the world that they're taking it seriously. They also, I think, want to specifically show to the Muslim world, look, the Americans have been constantly telling you that they're your friends. They've been trying to weaponize you against China itself. They've been talking up what's going on in Xinjiang region, for example, all of that. Look what the reality is. The Americans are not your friends. We are your friends. We are the people who really go and stand up for you when Muslims are being slaughtered in this fashion. So I think there is that message there too. But I think there's also there's an overriding one also, which is that China, of course, is projecting itself and is coming increasingly to be seen around the world as the single great stabilizer and defender of international law. And international law is clearly being violated in Gaza. There is a case going on now, the ICJ, about this fundamental violation of international law. And China, is the champion of international law, wants to be seen making its case there, because, of course, as I said, China is now very, very much the country that defends international law, the UN system, the whole system of precedent and law created over centuries, and this is their way to do it. So it's a very sophisticated act. Like everything China does, it's clearly very thought through.
It it's interesting that all these things, ICJ, United Nations, that they were established by the United States and the West, right? And now it seems like China is defending its system. I find that's interesting.
The paradox is absolutely remarkable, because what is so astonishing about this is that, of course, before the United States set itself up as the great exceptional country and the global superpower and all of those things, in the period, especially before the Second World War, between the First and Second World Wars, there was a huge amount of legal and juridical thinking in the United States from really superb international lawyers that they had at that time, which flatly was opposed to everything that the United States is doing today. And of course, it was this thinking, this American thinking, that lay behind the Nuremberg trials. And it was this thinking that was laid behind the establishment of the United Nations and the UN Charter and all of that. So what has actually happened is that all the countries around the world who joined up the United Nations bought into this American philosophy of international law and international relations, just as the Americans themselves, having found themselves in the position of the imperial colonial power, which they previously denounced when it was the Germans and the British and the French who were doing it. Well, having found themselves in that position, they turned their backs on it. It's very strange. It's not surprising that China is defending the system. The real surprise, or maybe not the surprise, but the tragedy, if you like, is that the United States has turned on the very system it played such an instrumental role in creating.
Yeah, and it's part of the reason people respect the United States in the past is because they set up these system, right? That giving people the idea that United States is not just interested in its own interest, at least giving the appearances, right? That United States wants a fair world order, right? The United Nations is a case in point, right? It's not just me, the United States, we have United Nations, right? So, but fundamentally, that's not really what the United States want, at least not now, that they want to dominate the world. The United States decide everything and dominate the United Nations. And that's why it finds these systems is kind of like this organization put in place. They find that they can no longer control it easily. That's when they kind of turn against it, right?
Well, this is exactly right. I mean, if you look at the rhetoric of the US government in the period of the Second World War, 1941 to 45, and for 1 or 2 years afterwards, it was very, very much, we're going to set up this international system. I mean, they persuaded Joseph Stalin, join into the UN. I mean, if you look at the negotiations of that time, it's very interesting to see how they were explaining to people like Stalin, look, we're not against you. We don't want to overthrow you. We are putting all that aside. We want to create a stable world system that will preserve peace. We're not looking to dominate the world. There's a very famous statement that was made by Joseph Jackson, who was the chief American prosecutor at the Nuremberg trials. And he said, everything that we are accusing the German leaders of, if we do it ourselves, we will stand condemned in the same way. I mean, he makes it absolutely clear. He says it there. And I mean, I'm sure these people, President Roosevelt and Joseph Jackson and all of those, I meant what they said. I think that they were sincere. But almost from the very first moment, the temptation of power became very strong. And it gradually evolved into the system we have today, when the United States is very frustrated by its own creations and accepts no limits on what it can do, no legal or moral limits on what it can do. And of course, it justifies that by saying that it's the exceptional nation, it sees further, stands taller, knows better than everyone else. So, of course, it has the right, supposedly, to disregard international law and disregard the institutions it itself created and decide everything for itself, which is, of course, the rules-based international order, with the United States setting the rules against the system of international relations, which it created, which the US itself created after the Second World War. It's actually a tragedy. If you know Greek tragedy, of course, which of course I was brought up, none of this would surprise you, actually. I mean, it has very much the quality of human tragedy. I'm going to say one thing, though. Again, I'm talking to Chinese people. It is a Western tragedy. It's the kind of temptation that Westerners, as we discussed, tend to be very drawn to power. It's what they would be led to. The temptation of power is just too strong. Yeah. And every step you could see how the Americans have done this step by step by step by step. They've led themselves to this. And you're absolutely right. At the end of the Second World War, they were the most popular country in the world. I mean, it's not widely known, but during the Chinese Civil War of the 1940s, after the Second World War ended, you know, Mao Zedong and Zhou Enlai met with US officials. They said, look, we're not against you. We want to be your friends. We Chinese people and American people actually have a lot in common. Just you know, we want to be part of this system that you're talking about, this democratic, fair, equal system. And the Americans already at that point were turning away.
Yeah, just like they turned down Putin trying to join NATO. It seems like trying to be US friend is very hard. US is very selective.
Well, it doesn't want friends. The United States doesn't want friends. It wants servants. It wants people who will, you know, obedient clients. A friend. Friendship implies equality, and that's not what today's America really wants to see in its relations with any country.
And in China, actually, they're saying that right, like you said, that Mao and Zhou, they try to working with the US, right? It's like, yes, we had a civil war, but once it's ended, our relationship doesn't have to suffer, right, between the US and China. But of course, like you said, we all know what happened, this Red Scare, you know, all kind of things. But then, of course, eventually, China opened up in the late 70s, and then US and China back in track almost. So what China is saying is we ended up where we should have started in 1950. So it's just 30 years later. That's where we ended up. It got the 30 years delay. So
that is exactly true. But of course, the reason that happened in the 1970s was not because there was a fundamental, this is, I think, a thing Chinese people perhaps are only gradually coming to understand. It wasn't because of a fundamental change of philosophy on the part of the US. It was because, of course, the US was locked into a Cold War confrontation with the Soviet Union. And it saw China as a potential ally at the time. I remember, I mean, again, my memory goes back to that time very vividly. I remember it very well. And people in the West, in the United States, talking about playing the China card. And I remember telling people at the time, this is silly. China is not a playing card. You can't just play China. I mean, that's an absurd way of thinking, but that is very much how the Americans do think. And of course, now with less success, they're trying to play the Indian card against China, and the Indians, of course, are pushing back because they say, you know, we have our issues with China, but we're not a playing card either.
Yeah, and they also were saying somebody lost China, right? As if it's somehow was the US to lose, you know, that's also a very interesting mentality.
Oh,
Now,
absolutely. I mean, everything is everything is a game. It's either a card game or a chess game, but
yeah,
it's a game in which the United States is moving pieces or playing cards. And of course, that is a fundamentally wrong view of international relations and of
yeah.
how to approach countries.
Now, Biden said that he hopes by Monday, which is March 4th, that there will be a ceasefire. Do you believe it's going to be a ceasefire? I don't know how to make it.
I'm I am deeply skeptical. I mean, if there
Okay.
is going to be a ceasefire, I suspect it's going to be a very temporary one,
Hmm.
and I can't see why Hamas would want a temporary ceasefire. By the
That's
way, so I doubt that there will be a ceasefire, but I think the Americans are saying this at the moment because they know the heat is on, and the heat is on them, and the heat is on Biden himself. I mean, it was notable that there was a heavy vote, a significant vote in the Michigan primary of people who were not voting for him, even though he had no opposing candidate. I mean, it was very strange. So I think they realize that the heat is on them. So they're trying to say, well, look, there's going to be a ceasefire. It's just, it's not going to be a permanent ceasefire. It's going to be a humanitarian ceasefire. But if you look at the rhetoric from Israel, it does not look to me like Israel is really interested in a
Yeah.
ceasefire. And if you're looking at Hamas, I don't see why they would agree to the kind of temporary ceasefire, which is all that Israel would offer.
That's what some of the media in China was saying, and they're even more cynical. They're saying, okay, he's doing that because March 5th is the Super Tuesday. So with
Yeah.
16 states, and he has to make a play or something. I mean, I don't know.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that's absolutely right. I don't think there's any real serious intention behind this.
Yeah.
And bear in mind, Blinken himself, he does not run the US government. Even Biden doesn't run the US government. There are all kinds of factions there. And some of them also don't want a ceasefire. So I don't think this is going to stick.
Yeah. Now, speaking of Blinken, so G20 foreign minister had a meeting. Wang Yi didn't even go. I think people become less and less thinking it's important, like a G20. Now, in the meantime, Wang Yi did participate in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. For him, obviously, that's more important. Now, the idea, my interpretation of the G20 is they are going to use that to criticize Russia, which they did. But other than that, what is your takeaway from that?
I think this is true. I think the G20 was very much a creation of the last period of the unipolar time. The Americans at that time, the British also, Gordon Brown was very prime minister at that period, British prime minister at that period, was very, very keen on the G20. And he used it during the financial crisis. He used the G20 as a mechanism to try and stabilize the world economy. So he wanted to pretend to people in Britain that he had done. Actually, again, I come back to China. The big economic stimulus that China did in 2008, what Obama eventually did in 2009, that had a much bigger impact. But, all right, Brown wanted to talk up the G20. I think the problem is the G20 might have worked well, except that the West has been creating dividing lines within the international system. So it doesn't want to meet countries like China, especially, or Russia on equal terms. And the result is that the G20 has never really come together and worked properly. So we see that the administration, the Biden administration, is much more happy working through the G7, the group of Western states plus Japan that are aligned with it, whilst China is gradually, increasingly now working towards focusing on the BRICS and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and all of those things. So the G20 is still there. It's still a potential bridge, but it's becoming a bridge between, don't want to say competing blocs, because the West is a bloc, but groupings of states, rather than the kind of central committee, if you like, the directory which runs the world economy. So again, American policy has brought it about. I mean, if you go around telling everybody that the world is divided into democracies and autocracies, and that you want to fight the autocracies, it doesn't really fit very easily with having meetings with the so-called autocracies, like at the G20. So that's probably why it's gradually fading away.
Yeah. And also, Macron said that he doesn't rule out the ground troops, right, in Ukraine. And then Scholz rejected that, saying he ruled that out. And in the meantime, Ukraine is signing the security agreements with several countries. What are they? What is going on here? Can you tell me what does that mean? Those security agreements.
This is right. I mean, there's the agreements which are, I think we discussed them previously, that these are basically scraps of paper, in the sense that they don't change the situation that Ukraine is in. Ukraine is not joining NATO soon. It's not been able to secure proper alliance treaties with Western countries. In fact, it would be impossible for Britain or France or Germany to enter into an outright alliance with Ukraine, because doing so would be contrary to their NATO obligations. So you get these security agreements, which are just, as I said, worthless pieces of paper. So that's one thing. But what is also happening simultaneously is that there is a major crisis for the West in Ukraine now. And it has two prongs. Firstly, Ukraine is losing the war. Everybody now can see it. Everybody can also see that the West is unable to arm Ukraine, not to the level that is needed for Ukraine to be able to hold back the Russians. So that is creating an atmosphere of panic. But there's also another, perhaps even bigger source of panic, in that the Europeans, and this is all coming from Europe now, can see what is going on in the United States, that there is still a block in funding of Ukraine from the US Congress. There's increasing criticism in the United States on the fringes of the overinvestment in this adventure. And I think what has also caused them enormous alarm, and this cannot be underestimated, is an article which appeared in the New York Times, which set out in great detail the kind of intelligence activities that the CIA, not really intelligence activities, covert activities, James Bond stuff that the United States has been involved in Ukraine. Now, the Europeans have known all about that. That's not what worries them. What worries them is not that the Americans have been doing this, but that the Americans are now publicly talking about it. And they're talking about it in a way that makes it look as if it's the Ukrainians who were doing all these crazy things, and the Americans were trying to restrain them. And given that this is disclosing confidential, classified information on an enormous scale, the assumption throughout Europe is that this is obviously being done with the agreement of important people in the United States government. And it's been taken as a sign that the intelligence community, the US intelligence community, is starting to disengage from Ukraine. It's pulling its people out. So they discuss all this, they disclose all this, they're trying to get their version of what happened out first. You don't talk about things like this, of this kind, if you have an ongoing operation. And so you want to get your story out first. You want to say it's the Ukrainians who did the bad things. You want to say how successful it all was. You want to put the blame on other people for the way things went wrong. But it's been seen in Europe, and by the way, in Ukraine itself, as a sign that the United States is starting to edge away. And this has also caused panic in Europe, and it has led to crazy decisions or crazy ideas, like Emmanuel Macron's idea of sending EU troops to fight the Russians in Ukraine, which nobody else wants to do apart from him, it seems. And also equally crazy ideas, which is to use Russian money, the money you're going to steal from the Russians, to buy shells in Africa and the Middle East from dodgy arms merchants and corrupt people, and corrupt governments. Get yourself shells, and this is going to be somehow the way to turn the situation around. So all of this has the look of panic and desperation about it.
Yeah, and another thing they are doing is that they're going to sanction China, India for helping Russia, right? And it's not just the China, India. It's I think it covers like 200 individuals and companies. There are even companies from Sri Lanka, Thailand, Serbia, Turkey. I mean, are they going to sanction, and even are they going to sanction everyone?
Well, they're heading that way now. I'm Greek, as you know. I'm a British person, but my origin is Greek. I used to have lots and lots of contacts with people in the Greek shipping world. To some extent, I still do. And what they're telling me is that international trade is now becoming a nightmare because all these secondary sanctions now. You go to a port, let's say it's Karachi, and you are buying there, let's say, pistachio nuts from a Pakistani company. What you don't know is that Pakistani company may have a shareholder who is based in, let's say, also in Pakistan, who's doing trade with China, with a business that might be exporting, I don't know, plastic to Russia. There's a sort of whole line of things which might lead to, sanctions to a person who's been sanctioned. And then, of course, at any moment, the EU Commission or the Treasury can sort of come back and say, this is links up, you're supporting, you're providing help to a sanctioned person or entity, and therefore you're going to be fined yourself. And apparently the insurance costs are becoming impossible, and people are becoming very, very nervous about conducting even the most simple, basic systems of trade anymore. But they don't stop because their sanctions war, their economic war against Russia failed, which has been a great shock to them. They can't leave it at that because it's what made them feel strong that they could impose these sanctions on these countries. If they can't break Russia, they can't break China, they can't break all sorts of other countries. So, like children, they just can't go on doing the same thing again and again, more and more of it, and it makes more and more trouble. It makes lots of people very angry. It'll make governments in Thailand, in India, Turkey, and extremely angry. The Indians apparently are absolutely beside themselves with anger over this kind of thing. But, they just go on doing it because they know no else.
Well, but in the same time, they themselves still buying refined oil from Russia, right? And that's not secret. Both EU and the United States are buying from Russia, so they don't do it themselves. But they don't expect other countries to stop buying from Russia. It doesn't make any sense. It's not logical. It's crazy.
But you're applying logic in the way that the Chinese people apply logic. If you're an American, or at least you're a member of the American government, you say, well, the rules-based international order means that we set the rules. So, if we decide that we're not applying these rules to ourselves, well, that's fine, but everybody else must observe them. That's their logic. And that's the problem. So, and that's the problem. That's why, by the way, this is an unsustainable and ultimately absurd system. And what you've cited is the perfect example of this. The US, the Europeans, who are just as bad, by the way, give themselves the right to impose these sanctions, which, by the way, violate international law. I think this is an important point always to bear in mind. If America imposes sanctions against Russia, well, no country is under a legal duty to trade with another country. That's America's business. That's
Mhm.
Russia's business.
Mhm.
So you can make a legal case for it. I mean, there might be, WTO rules that you're violating or things like that. But you can make a kind of case. But sanctioning someone in a third country
Mhm.
because they're applying the laws of their own country to trade with yet another country with which their country might be on good terms, but which the United States is not. Well, that is manifestly illegal. That has no basis as international law and international commercial law. And it is straightforwardly wrong. But, forget about international law. Forget about what the chaos it's doing to the world trading system. Forget about the feelings of governments and in countries that you want to be your friends. You embody the rules-based international order. The rules are what you say they are, and you just go ahead and do it.
Yeah, that's yeah. A few almost comical things I wanted to see your reaction. Boris Johnson apparently asked for $1 million to grant interview to Tucker Carlson. So, what is the reaction from the British media? I mean, Johnson, am I right that he comes from a relatively privileged background, but he seems like
Oh,
he behaved like somebody who never seen money. What is going on here?
you're absolutely correct. You're entirely right. He does come from a privileged background. He went to Eton. He's comes from a wealthy, privileged, uh, not exactly aristocratic family, but family that is perhaps on the fringe of that world. And so, I mean, he's hardly short of things, and he's had very well paid jobs and things of that kind. But you know what they say: the appetite grows with the eating. It's never enough. And it doesn't surprise me actually, because the whole nature of Johnson and of the government he ran, and I'm afraid of British politics to a great extent today, is very, very much about enrichment nowadays. $1 million for an interview would not be. It didn't surprise me as a story. Let me put it that way.
Mhm. It surprised me a little bit, but because even though I don't think
Mm.
much of Johnson, but I just thought this is so low. Now, of course, he later said he claimed that he's going to donate the money to charities. Well, yeah, but
Well, he said that because Tucker Carlson disclosed the fact that he'd asked for that fee,
yeah,
and he
yeah,
was a bit embarrassed about it. But I mean, he noticed he's not denying
yeah.
that he asked for that money. So, and I think this is something which, again, maybe Chinese people are not aware of. But when I came to Britain as a boy in the 1960s, there was, to all intents and purposes, almost no corruption
Hmm.
within the British political class. I mean, it was astonishingly clean at that time. Today, I'm afraid it is completely different. Levels of corruption in Britain, in public life, are just completely out of control. And Johnson is an extreme case. But I mean, going back about 20 years, and things have got a lot worse since then, but going back 20 years, I mean, Tony Blair as Prime Minister was being investigated for selling honours in order to raise money for his re-election. And, things have got far, far worse from that time.
Yeah, yeah. And another thing is Biden in a fundraising event called the Putin SOB. It's not that long ago. He also another fundraising event he called Xi Jinping a dictator, right? It seems like those fundraising events become some kind of venue for Biden to unleash his anger, his agitation, his jealousy. It seems like it just led him to throw tantrum amongst his people because those are his donors, right? Is that what is going on?
That's
That's
exactly that's it. That is exactly what it is. I mean, Biden is a very angry man and has been so for a long, long time. And he has very, very great difficulty in maintaining discipline over what he says. I mean, I have to say, I mean, what he said about Putin did not surprise me at all. For me, the most extreme example of this, the most striking example of this is that, was it a year ago, 2 years ago, he made his State of the Union address, and he said some extraordinary things about Xi Jinping over them, you know, who would be in Xi Jinping's place. And he did this. You could see that he was almost shaking with anger as he was doing this. And, you know, there was already a discordance between what he was saying and his very obvious anger. You say, who in the world would want to be in Xi Jinping's place? Well, if that's what you really think, then why are you so angry? Why are you, the president of the United States, so angry? Mm-hmm. But you could see that he has terrible trouble keeping control of his feelings. Yeah. And obviously, you know, in governmental situations, he tries, but when he's with donors, he doesn't bother. He just says what he wants.
Yeah, that's how I take it. I mean, I don't take it seriously, and of course, Putin doesn't take it seriously, and it's just kind of like brush it off. This guy, you can't really take him very seriously now.
Well, that's right. That's exactly right. Yeah.
Yeah. And then also Blinken said something that got lots of attention in the Chinese social media. He said, I think it's in the Munich security conference, he said that if you are not at the table in the international system, you're going to be on the menu. Okay, so now there's some reactions. So Hua Chunying, she posted on her social network, Twitter. Hua Chunying is the spokesperson for Chinese foreign minister, so she's official. Yeah, and so her Twitter X is kind of interesting. So she posted a picture and just compared it to where on the left, Wang Yi said the lose-lose is not a rational choice and win-win is the future of mankind. And then, you know, put in what Blinken said. So that's one reaction, right? And then the other one is I love Lavrov. I don't see the West reported that, but Lavrov, the Chinese media said, Lavrov said, well, I hope in that case, I hope our hungry American friends don't choke on the table of democracy. so, and then even the UN General Secretary Office, also somebody asked them, you know, what's their reaction to Blinken's characterization of today's international affairs. And the General Secretary's office said that their spokesperson said that we have 133, I think, members at the table. So we have everybody on the table, something like that. Yeah. What is your read to this?
Well, I mean, you know, the paradox of this is that I think Blinken, in his own idiotic way, is trying to impart some sense to people in the United States, because there is a current view in the United States. I mean, John Bolton, Donald Trump's former national security advisor, embodies this, which is the United States doesn't really need to be talking to anybody because, you know, we're so powerful, we're so strong, we can just do what we like. I mean, Bolton once said, you know, about the UN Security Council that he was UN ambassador at that time, US ambassador to the UN. He said, I don't understand why other countries are represented on this council. There should be only one country, and that's the US. So, I mean, there is that attitude. And I think what Blinken was trying to say, to educate people like that by saying, you know, this isn't a good idea. We do need to talk to people, because if we don't, then it won't work to our advantage. But he does it with this absolutely bizarre comment, which tells you so much about the American perspective of things, which is that, you know, either you eat others or they eat you. I mean, and you know, I'm glad. I mean, I like the way the Chinese spokesman said, you know, it's either no lose or win-win, because I mean, you know, that's what diplomacy is about. It is trying to find win-win situations. The Americans see everything as, they see diplomacy, to the extent that they talk about diplomacy at all, they see it as another arena of conflict. Mm-hmm. They see it as winning a game always against someone. So if you don't participate in the game, you lose. Well,
And
that is a very strange view of diplomacy.
and that's probably partially explained. Sometimes the State Department is more hawkish than the Department of Defense, I find, right? That they're supposed to do diplomacy, but they're very, very hawkish, I find.
You're absolutely correct. I mean, I obviously have to interview on the Duran American people from the State Department sometimes, or former State Department people and military people. Of course, there were old guard, genuine diplomats within the State Department, but they're all retired and they're all very old. But you have lots of military people, colonels and people like that, much, much younger, people who've just recently left the army. And they're in despair about this because, of course, being soldiers, they understand what conflict really is. And they understand what the difference between diplomacy and conflict is. And some of the most trenchant and intelligent criticism of the US government's policies are actually made by soldiers.
Okay, I want to ask you about the Budapest Memorandum. Wang Yi was asked that during this Munich security conference. And in the beginning, when the war broke in Ukraine, there was a lot of discussion about that. And Ukraine felt like it's let down because there's some security assurances by 5 permanent UN security members. So, and like, for example, Ukraine feel like China does not fulfill its obligation. And that was the question asked, right? Now, so when I look back and read this, it's actually pretty complicated. First of all, it's actually not just for Ukraine, right? It's also regarding Belarus and Kazakhstan. So it's for 3 countries, and basically the idea is for them to not to have a nuclear weapon, and all the nuclear weapon goes to Russia. For one thing, it sounds to me like the Ukrainians' nuclear weapon actually belong to Russia, but it's physically in Ukraine. But anyway, so from Ukraine's perspective, I can see that Ukraine feel like you need to protect me, and instead, one of you attacked me, and then the rest of you, some of them, you help me, but China doesn't. But from China's perspective is, well, the best way to help you is to end this war. So we're not giving weapons to either side because that's how we see we can end this war. Now, from Russian side is, yes, I also signed the memorandum, but the idea of the whole memorandum is you don't have nuclear weapon, but if you join NATO, NATO can, in principle, put nuclear weapon in your country. So that's defeat the whole purpose. So from any angle, it seems like it makes sense, but at the same time, it's contradict all sides also.
Well, the thing to understand about the Budapest Memorandum is that it was part of a whole web of agreements and understandings that were reached between the superpowers of that era, the Soviet Union and the United States, and then between Russia and the United States, and between Russia and the European countries and NATO, which brought about the end of the Cold War. It wasn't, it's not something that ought to be seen in isolation. So it was part of it included concepts of arms control, concepts, treaties, arms control treaties. There were the promises not to extend NATO eastwards. There was the provision within Ukraine's own constitution that the country would be neutral. You're absolutely correct in saying, by the way, that Ukraine never possessed nuclear weapons. The Soviet Union possessed nuclear weapons. When the Soviet Union broke up, all the nuclear weapons automatically passed to Russia, and the strategic forces, which were the elite of the Soviet armed forces, en masse, they transferred their loyalties to Russia. So the Russians always had operational control of these weapons. The Ukrainians never did. It was not the Ukrainians handing over weapons to Russia because they never had them in the first place. But it was a web of agreements, all of which worked together. There was the Helsinki Final Act from 1975. There were all kinds of further agreements that were developed over the course of the 1990s. What then started to happen is that they were all unraveled. So firstly, there was the invitation that was extended to Ukraine in 2008 to join NATO, which, I mean, violated fundamental agreements that had been reached between the West and Russia, and between Russia and Ukraine, going back, as I said, to the period of the end of the Cold War. There was also all kinds of changes that started to happen within Ukraine itself, like steady erosion of the neutrality clause in its constitution, which long preceded the Maidan events of 2014. And there was, I mean, the Budapest Memorandum was also largely predicated on non-interference in the internal affairs of all of the countries involved. But there was massive interference by the Western powers in the internal affairs in Ukraine. By the way, when the United States, about 3 years ago, involved itself in the attempted color revolution in Belarus, they were asked, aren't you yourselves now violating the Budapest Memorandum? And they came out with a statement. The US Embassy in Minsk, in Belarus, actually said, well, actually, the Belarus Memorandum doesn't really apply. It doesn't exist anymore. So, I mean, you know, again, they move things. Anyway, so the Americans were interfering in the internal situation in Ukraine. And of course, they engineered or helped engineer the overthrow of the elected president of Ukraine. We've just now learned that the very same day that that president was overthrown, they were entering into an enormous intelligence partnership with the intelligence agencies of Ukraine to launch a kind of secret war against Russia. An astonishing article, as I said, discusses in the New York Times. So, I mean, you know, you can't, the thing people need to understand about international law is you can't take one part of it and simply disregard the rest. You can't discover legality when it suits you and forget it when it doesn't. I mean, international law doesn't work like that. And I mean, bear in mind, we've also had the Minsk agreements, which, you know, they didn't observe or apply. And so we don't talk about any of that. We talk about the Budapest Memorandum. That's all we ever talk about without taking into context anything else.
Well, China just get under some pressure because China also not initially, I think initially just the US, UK, and those, I mean, US, UK, and Russia. And then, of course, those three countries, right? But then France and China later signed something in pretty much like we agreed to that or something. But yeah. China's argument is, yes, we want to see peace and we're working towards that. That's basically what China has been doing. And by not sending weapons to either side, China believes that can end the war earlier, you know, end it quicker. That's how China, I guess, trying to help the situation.
Well, this is, I mean, China is not violating the Budapest Memorandum. China has nothing to do with any of this. I mean, you know, this is, I mean, blaming China or saying, you know, China should be more involved. I mean, is again absurd because, of course, they say this on the one hand, but of course, they don't really want China to be involved at the same time either. This is just, again, a rhetorical device. They say they want the Chinese to put pressure on the Russians. In other words, to jeopardize their own relations with the Russians. I remember years ago, many years ago, and I was a student at university, I went to a lecture given by the very great British historian A.J.P. Taylor. He was talking about Western attitudes to Russia. And he was talking about the period of the Second World War. And he was saying that the West likes to use Russia like a tap. It turns it on when it needs its help, and it switches it off when it doesn't. And you can see that they're doing exactly the same as China. They want to use China like a tap. They want to turn it on in order to get China to put pressure on Russia. But they at the same time, they want to turn it off when it comes to other issues like Taiwan, for example, or trade, or any of the other multiple things that they're concerned about. The fact of the matter is, if you look at the principles of a settlement of the conflict that China outlined last year, and which the West wasn't happy about, by the way, I can't see that they violate the Budapest Memorandum in any way. I mean, I really can't. I don't see there in what way China is departing from the Budapest Memorandum, even though to all practical purposes, that's dead.
Yeah. I think what they want is to China to be on their side, to go against Russia, sanction Russia, stuff like that. Yeah.
I think that. I mean, they must realize by now that that isn't going to happen.
Yeah.
But they also want to embarrass the Chinese.
Yeah.
Which is childish thing to want to do. I mean, how does that? It's absurd to think that the Chinese are going to be embarrassed by this, or that the rest of the world is going to be impressed. It's it's schoolboy diplomacy. It's the kind of thing that clever schoolboys do, but it doesn't actually mean anything.
Mm-hmm. Which is good lead us to the next question. Is this 60 Minutes I talked to you about the Leslie Stahl interviewed Nicholas Burns, the U.S. ambassador to China. There are quite a few things, but I'll just pick the one that I find most interesting. First of all, it says Leslie Stahl claimed that Xi Jinping said that the East is rising, the West is declining. I actually don't think Xi Jinping himself ever said that. I think there are scholars saying that, and they're in the West, there are people saying that, but people who are saying that, even the scholars in China saying that, it's not like that's China's goal. It's their observation. It's not like this is our purpose, that East will rise and the West will decline. That's not the goal of China. It's an observation. But of course, that, Leslie Stahl, the way she says it, okay. The other thing is that this is what Nicholas Burns said. The China-U.S. relationship is the most important, most competitive, and most dangerous relationship that the United States has in the world right now. And I think it will continue for the next decade or so. Now, this sentence in the Chinese media interpret that as the U.S. believe that the U.S. has 10 years to deal with China. Then if U.S. wins, U.S. wins. If U.S. lose, U.S. will lose. 10 years, the window. Is that how you see it? How that?
Yes, absolutely. Now, can I just first of all turn to what Xi Jinping is supposed to have said? He never said anything like that. I've been following Xi Jinping's statements very, very closely. He has never spoken about the United States in that sort of way. In fact, in I think his last meeting with Biden in San Francisco, he went out of his way to say the opposite. That China is not looking to replace the United States as, the great leading power in the world. China wants a good, stable, win-win relationship with the United States. And if you look at every single comment made by every single senior Chinese official, Xi Jinping, Wang Yi, whoever, that's what they all say. Now, of course, we've got academics and journalists who probably talk in this way from time to time. Probably many more talk about American decline in the West, I suspect, than do in China, actually. Mm-hmm. I don't think Chinese are very interested in this topic, if I have to be honest. I mean, it's the Americans and the Western powers that are fixated with the question of decline and who are worried about the fact that China might replace them. Most people looking at this would say, well, look, history means that a country that's much bigger than yourself, when it sorts itself out and becomes rich, will eventually in aggregate power overtake you. But that's what happens. That doesn't mean you're in decline. It just means that the world changes and moves on. It's an organic process. I think that's very much the Chinese view, by the way. But of course, it's the Americans who are obsessed about primacy, obsessed about leadership, and attribute to the Chinese government's plans, which the Chinese government has never once expressed. And I think this is a key thing to say. And that brings me to the second point of what he said. Why is this relationship competitive and dangerous? Who is choosing to make it so? Go look at every single statement the Chinese officials have made, from Xi Jinping down, and Chinese foreign policy spokesman Wang Yi, various prime ministers. Not one person in China is looking to make this relationship dangerous or competitive. On the contrary, they want to make a win-win relationship out of it. It's the Americans who always see things in terms of great power competition and control and ascendancy, and one power being superior to the other power and dominating the other, applying, if I have to say, Western and European conceptions of international relations to a country like China, which is not Western and not European, but which has a completely different history and experience in international relations. But you're absolutely correct. They're saying to themselves, we've got 10 years. Our economy is fragile. We've got debt exploding. The Chinese Navy is growing much faster than our Navy is. Of course, we don't think about trying to talk to the Chinese about limiting naval presences in the Pacific. Of course, if we did that, we would have to discuss Taiwan, because it's an essential part of that issue. We would have to discuss access to the South China Sea, because that's an essential part of the issue. But we don't want to find mutually acceptable solutions to problems. We see it all as competitive. We see it all as dangerous. We've given ourselves this time. We're going to say 10 years. And if we can't succeed, if we can't push the Chinese back at that time, well, who knows?
Yeah, that's pretty much, the whole conversation is very interesting in that sense, that it reviews a lot of their mentality. So here he said, following Speaker Nancy Pelosi's visit, we've seen now for 16 months a much higher rate of Chinese both air activity and naval activity. That's very intimidating and meant to be, and they haven't pulled back on that. And I think ultimately they want to become and overtake the United States as a dominant country globally. And we don't want that to happen. We don't want to live in a world where the Chinese are the dominant country. See, that's very revealing, isn't it? For one thing, he admits Nancy Pelosi's visit actually created more tension. That's refreshed to know.
Well, absolutely. I mean, I have to say, as you're telling me all of this, I'm asking myself, what kind of an ambassador is this? I mean, what does he think he is doing in Beijing? I mean, ambassadors, of course, who are supposed to be diplomats, are supposed to be there to try and find some way forward in the relationships between their countries. And he's talking in this way. He talks about the Chinese military build-up, their air activity, their naval activity. What about the United States? Does it engage in no air or naval activity? I mean, it's bombing people in the Middle East as we're speaking. It's sending ships into the South China Sea. It's sending ships into the Taiwan Strait. China sends a few ships to the Red Sea, but they don't bomb anybody there. They don't bomb anybody in the Middle East. And if we're talking about Chinese naval and aircraft activity over China's territory and in the seas around China and close to Taiwan, which the United States itself recognizes is a part of China. Well, surely if the Chinese are doing that, it's because, firstly, it is their right to conduct military operations over their own country. But secondly, it is probably because, listening to rhetoric like this, they themselves feel threatened. And it's not surprising when, we hear an ambassador, a US ambassador to China talking in this way. I mean, clearly, this man has shown no interest in understanding China at all, or understanding Chinese perspectives on problems, or relating to the concerns, the entirely legitimate security concerns and other concerns that China, and by the way, the Chinese people generally, I'm sure, have.
Yeah, and he still, I mean, this is when he said that ultimately China wants to become and overtake United States as a dominant country. You see, they always have this in mind that the US has to be the dominant country. In their world, that like equality doesn't exist, right? We just coexist equally. That concept doesn't exist, is it?
No, of course it doesn't, absolutely doesn't exist. This is actually a problem because, of course, the United States, throughout its history, ever since it gained its independence from Britain, has dominated those it has found it's those around it. It dominated the Latin American states, the Caribbean states. It expanded. It has no experience of ever dealing with another country as an equal. I mean, this is a major problem for anybody who has to deal with the United States. China has a different history. It's the world's oldest country. I mean, it goes back, well, Chinese people know better than me, to the Xia dynasty, all the way, millennia back. They have a completely different history. They understand that they have to live and work with other people. And why would the Chinese want to dominate the world? Why would China be interested in, what goes on in Minnesota or Britain or, the Galapagos Islands or wherever? I mean, that's never been the Chinese way. And I see no sign that that is the Chinese way today. I see no indication that the Chinese want to reorder international relations in that kind of manner.
Yeah. But if you look at that interview, that's where the scare, the feeling is, because towards the end of the interview, he also said that Soviet had a strong military but weak economy. China had China as our adversary and competitor. It's a competition of ideas, a battle of ideas. Our idea, Americans' big idea of a democratic society and human freedom versus Chinese idea that a communist state is stronger than democracy. We don't believe that. So there is a battle here, and as whose idea should lead the world, and we believe those are American ideas. China never said that a communist state is stronger than democracy. China never said our idea is better than yours. In fact, I think China, actually many times the Chinese government go out of its way saying every country is different. China is unique in a lot of ways, which means our idea, our experience doesn't necessarily apply everywhere. So every country should find your own path to success. That's what China always saying. It never says our idea is somehow better, stronger than yours, and that should be the dominant idea. China never does that. I just think Nicholas Burns just doesn't understand China.
No, he doesn't understand China. And again, I mean, one wonders whether he's even interested in understanding it. I mean, one would have thought that an ambassador would work hard to try and understand the country that he's posted to, but it doesn't seem as if he did. And of course, the other word there that is really very disturbing is he's talking about a battle of ideas. He's already using the language of war, that this is a struggle. And actually, when you take a step back and you listen and think about his words, what you sense is that it's not really China that concerns him, it's the US, the position of the US itself. He is worried that the United States is losing its priority. This is a common amongst a lot of Americans and American leaders. They are worried about the US losing its primacy. And it's they who have staked, never China, as you correctly say, they who staked out this idea that the United States is at the vanguard of history, that every country and nation and people in the world will adopt their system of government and their ideology and, the capitalistic nature of their economy and that kind of thing. They argue for that universalism. And what is frightening them is that they're starting to worry that that isn't going to happen. And they see in China an example of a country that's succeeding without adopting all of this. And this is making them very, very scared, because I suspect at one level also they are starting to doubt the legitimacy of their own enterprise because of the risk of its eventual failure. So they're looking for someone to blame, and they're blaming China.
Yeah. But it's also interesting. I mean, if you look at that interview, there's a lot of contradiction there. It's also very interesting. On the one hand, he seems a very, battle, those kind of a hawkish and but at the same time, he's also saying that the China-US relationship right now, he said his words is a settle and stable. And he also said that divorce is not an option because the two countries has too much trade, too much connection, together, etc. And then he described the whole thing about the battle and stuff like that. So I just find the whole thing very interesting. Kind of like he can't even make up his own mind, exactly how to deal with China. What I find also interesting is that I was reading another article. At one point, apparently, Boris Yeltsin actually was frustrated with negotiating with the West, how to, after the collapse of Soviet Union, how to work with the West. And Yeltsin said, it seems like you guys want to turn the Cold War into a cold peace. Actually, I think probably US-China right now has a cold peace. I think that's a good word to describe it. Don't you agree?
Yes, I think it's exactly correct. I mean, the point about decoupling is a fascinating one, because again, they're up against the limits of their own power, something that they're very frustrated about. So one senses his underlying visceral feelings. China is the adversary. China is the enemy. China is the country that is, might take over from us. We're in decline. They're strong. We've got to sort this out within 10 years. Otherwise, well, the worst will happen. We don't really know what the worst is, but presumably the worst will happen. At the same time, China is the major economic power. You can't decouple from it. There's a long article, as I just discussed just before we started the program, a long article in The Economist, which admits that decoupling is impossible, and that US-China trade, if you look beneath some of the statistics, is actually as strong as ever. They can't decouple from it. They're tied to China, and they can't risk decoupling with. They can't break with China in the way that they try to break with Russia. I mean, even with Russia, they've only been successful to a limited degree, but Russia's a much smaller economy than China's is, so they can't do it. And of course, it frustrates them, and it creates this kind of confusion to the point of schizophrenia, in which, on the one hand, the Chinese are out to conquer the world, and they're this existential threat to us, and we're in a battle with them, a battle of ideas with them. And on the other hand, we have to keep the relationship stable, because if we don't, we will suffer terrible and very grave consequences. So you could see the tension, and it's a very one word I don't agree with him about is stable. When your partner is as confused and schizophrenic as this, you can never be confident that the relationship is a stable one. I must admit, I understand exactly what you mean about Boris Yeltsin, and he was clearly very frustrated and talked about cold peace. And the relationship between China and the US is also a cold peace, a loveless marriage. I mean, you see, he brought up the topic of divorce. Yeah. It's a loveless marriage from which divorce is impossible.
Yeah, so he's right then to saying, he doesn't want it. I mean, he admits that divorce is not an option. Yeah, which I find interesting. Yeah. And cold peace, loveless marriage. Yeah, those are all good descriptions.
Which, of course, but there was this. It's important to stress again. This is an American perspective. I mean, the Chinese do not see this in that way. I mean, again, it's not difficult. You see all of the comments that the Chinese themselves make, and they clearly do not see things in this sort of way.
Yeah.
So there's no need to talk like this. There's no need to talk about divorce, because the Chinese say, forget about all of that.
Yeah.
We just want to trade with you.
Yeah.
We just want to have peace with you. We don't want to have quarrels and battles with you.
Yeah.
This is a conflict of your own imagination.
Yeah, I think so too. But somehow that's the mindset. It's very hard to change. I find that.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it is a fact. If somebody believes something and
Mm-hmm.
believes it with this level of intensity, it's almost impossible to change, regardless of how strong the facts are.
Yeah. Well, last question. I always want to have a little bit, lighthearted questions. And so, Eurovision Song Contest. Iceland voted for a Palestinian singer to participate in Eurovision Song Contest, which is interesting. I just have this question now. Israel, why is it like Israel, Cyprus, Armenia, Morocco? I mean, Australia? I think why are all these countries in the Euro Song Contest? They're not European countries. First of all,
this is absolutely true. I mean, some of them would argue that they were. Armenia and Cyprus would probably argue that they were. But Morocco. But why are they? Well, first of all, in terms of their own countries, it's nice to be part of the Eurovision Song Contest. It makes you feel, that you have an entry into Europe, which might be useful, because Europe is still a rich and prosperous place which you want to be in. Why do the Europeans want this? Because of course they also have a kind of expansionist agenda behind it. They want to spread their influence to all sorts of places. They want to bring people in, Palestinians, Moroccans, you name it, because that's partly the nature of the European project. It must expand. And I actually have no issue with other countries joining the Eurovision Song Contest. I stopped watching it years ago. But anyway, there it is.
Well, yeah, Eurovision Song Contest is very, I guess, very popular within Europe, right? It's not as many people pay attention to it outside Europe. When I was living in Sweden, it was a big thing. What's interesting is that there is tensions even amongst the Scandinavian countries, like Sweden and Norway. Sweden actually is a big song country. And so they always were interested in it because of that. And then that's where they feel like they are better than Norway, better than Finland, etc. So lots of people pay attention for that reason. And that's why I pay attention to it as well. I just find that tension is kind of interesting by itself, play out. But now it seems like it's sometimes getting political as well, right? So now it's interesting to see this Palestinian person going there. Everybody will pay attention to that, representing Iceland. I find that's interesting. So this year, maybe it's, worth just pay attention to that part of it, I think. So.
Well, you're absolutely correct. I mean, I can remember the Eurovision Song Contest in the 70s when I did used to watch it and watch it a lot. The time when you talk about Sweden, when ABBA was, winning in the Europe, and it was just fun. It was just an opportunity to find out what the good, successful hit groups were in European countries, and you used to listen. It was fun. Everything is political. Everything, sport, politics, pop music, everything has to have a kind of geopolitical quality about it. So, you make sure Ukraine wins, you bring in Palestinians, you do all of this kind of thing. And of course, whatever geopolitical point you're making, you rob your own people of that sense of fun.
Yeah. Yes, I agree. It should be entertaining, right? Not so much tension put in there. Yeah, I agree. Yeah. Okay, so that's all I have for this week. Another packed events week, and so thank you for spending time to discuss all these with me. Thank you so much.